Nimen Hao, and welcome to Chinese Classic Novels, a bridge to linguistic and intercultural competence, the NCC Startalk summer program for 2021. I am Dr. Stuart Patterson, the chairperson of the Scheimer Great Book School at North Central College, and it is my great honor to be presenting today on a project that I've been working on for a number of years now with Dr. Jinai Sun, the director of the Startalk program. Specifically, I'll be offering a model lesson on the person you see there peeking through the gauze blinds of her litter. She is, of course, Dai-yu, arriving at the home of the Jia in the third chapter of The Dream of the Red Chamber, in my opinion, the greatest of China's four classic novels. But before I turn to Dai-yu, I will be offering some background on how I put my model lesson together. So to start, I will suggest a few reasons that teaching Chinese classic novels help us pursue the general Startalk principle to integrate the teaching of culture, content, and language. And then I will offer some background on humanistic teaching methods, which means knowing what kinds of questions you can use to lead discussion about the classic novels toward insights that will open up the idea of intercultural communication and hopefully motivate language learning. And then finally, I will turn back to Dai-yu's arrival among the Jia and walk you through a model lesson on that story, which I would teach in English, of course, using a translation of The Dream of the Red Chamber, though you may take ideas for a lesson in Chinese, depending on your student's level. So in my lesson, I'll suggest some passages to excerpt from the classic novel and provide enough background to engage students' imaginations while leaving them some room to explore larger themes in a passage like that on Dai-yu's arrival. And then I'll illustrate the kinds of big themes that I mean to investigate with humanistic methods by reference to the advanced placement exam in Chinese culture and language. And I will finish by presenting very briefly a resource created by Sun Laoshu that turns students' reading about Dai-yu into language lessons, and you can ask her more about that. So why teach intercultural awareness and language through the four classic novels of China, namely in their most common English titles, The Water Margin, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Journey to the West, which I have pictured here, and of course Dream of the Red Chamber. So let me suggest three separate but related reasons that I would argue that the classic novels are important and useful. First, the classic novels are among the most authentic materials you can offer your students, even in translation, I would argue. They are, according to the Chinese, the most important stories that the Chinese tell about themselves to themselves, and by extension to the rest of the world. That is, they are the stories that the Chinese use to know themselves and to pass that knowledge on from generation to generation, which is about as authentically Chinese as you can get. Of course, there are other Chinese novels, important Chinese stories, but for better or worse, these are the ones that bear the designation classic. And so even if one disagrees with that designation, it still is the case that you have to come to terms with it. So second reason I would give that you want to study these novels is that they are called classics for a good reason. And that is that they're still the most popular and interesting and engaging stories that the Chinese have to tell about themselves. So they present a variety of what we might call exemplary situations, kinds of interactions, problems being solved, problems being created, all kinds of ways to illustrate themes, deep themes in Chinese life and history, but in a very entertaining way. And they're highly excerptable because of the form that the Chinese novel or xiaoshuo takes in general. So that's an advantage, and you can offer that to your students as itself a signal difference between Chinese novels and Western novels, which can be very hard to excerpt. Third, and most importantly, the classic novels offer a wide range of themes and issues for your students to investigate. In a nutshell, they present the foundations of Chinese culture and a touch in the same way on essentially human questions. In The Dream of the Red Chamber, for example, we see an intimate portrayal of how the Chinese think about love, for example, or family, or even table manners, which is something that cuts across cultures. So we see how the Chinese do it, but we can also relate those themes to how we in our culture apart from the Chinese think and act and feel about such things. So this will allow your students to compare their own lives to the lives of the people being portrayed in the novels. And because the stories are distinct and that each of the novels covers a different aspect of Chinese history and life, you can use them to address different students. You may have a group of students who are interested more in adventure. You may have a group of students who are interested more in spiritual or religious history and thought, in which case you can use Journey to the West. If they're interested in adventure, you can use Outlaws or Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and if you're interested in intimate relations, you can use Dream of the Red Chamber. So they're quite adaptable, and you may want to change the aspects of culture that you're looking at. Then, once you've excerpted a story from whichever of the novels appeals to you and your students, how do you teach it? If you follow the methods that I'm going to present here, you teach a bit of helpful background on the novel and its history, and then mainly what you do is you ask questions. This teaching strategy that we are going to talk about here is typically referred to as humanistic, but often also goes by the name of Socratic. Why Socratic? The man picture here, Socrates, was famous for the questions that he asked in search of understanding of big themes like virtue and love and justice. So for good or ill, Socratic questions, as they're known, are those which we have to ask at some point. They apply to characteristics of human experience that we all know, but that resist any final answers. So when you use these kinds of questions in relation to the novel, the students are going to be using the novel to investigate bigger questions. And you'll be at an advantage because you'll have the text there in front of you and the student. So it's helpful to address these big questions with a common text. But while a Socratic discussion revolves around these big questions, we don't do that directly. Rather, there are a series of questions that we typically use in Socratic discussion to open, to carry the discussion through, and then to close. So specifically, we use 4 different kinds of questions. The first is the opening question, which sets the topic of the general discussion, usually by inviting students to evaluate a character or an action within the text. For example, to explore the idea of authority or ability or one's place in human society, one might ask, for example, if Sun Wukong was right to rebel against the Jade Emperor when he was made a stable boy, even though he was one of the most powerful beings in the universe. This kind of opening question highlights possible differences in view between students, and it invites them to judge Sun Wukong and the Jade Emperor, for example, and compare how they feel about these things with others in the class, but also in whatever standards they can glean from the text itself. And then the ensuing discussion is really an effort to clarify and answer the opening question. And you can do that with comprehension questions, which group members use to clarify aspects of the text, each other's views, and interpretive questions, which are used to kind of bring out what people feel about one or another aspect of the text, or aspects of the text that aren't explicit but need interpretation. Finally, to end a discussion, we turn to what I am calling here a generalizing question. This kind of question relates the discussion of the text to the students' own lives. For example, asking whether students themselves have ever rebelled or felt like rebelling against authority in any way, like Sun Wukong. Alternatively, you can use a generalizing question to relate a text to a current issue or figure of interest. So, what public figures you think resemble Sun Wukong or the Jade Emperor could be a way of wrapping up a discussion. And you can use generalizing questions like this also in the midst of a discussion if you find the discussion flagging, but you would offer this only if the students need that kind of help. Once a discussion is underway, we like for students to carry it on as much themselves as possible, leading with their own questions and views, not waiting for you to interpret the text, but starting to exchange views of their own, which is why I have there the note about collective critical inquiry. Getting the students to talk to each other is really going to be how they become most invested in the activity of reading and understanding, but it'll also be a good way for them to retain what it is they've read. And then finally, about this kind of humanistic teaching, one of the reasons it's so important is because it doesn't just invest students in reading novels or entertaining stories. Rather, it is a kind of practice for the habits of mind and even action that lead to what the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, calls global competence. In the instrument that PISA uses to evaluate students' global competence, they set out 4 progressive cognitive abilities. First, the ability to identify global issues through knowledge of other cultures around the globe. And second, the ability to understand disparate worldviews and perspectives. Third, the ability to judge when an intercultural interaction is effective or not. And fourth, to know what constitutes respectful, sustainable global actions and how to undertake them. In assessing these cognitive abilities, PISA does exactly what we're describing you're doing in class. That is, they give students stories to read and judge, to understand and judge. Preparing for and taking the PISA test involves exactly the kinds of reading and judgment that literature does. So the humanistic study of literature is not only a great way to understand, to gain competence in one's own culture, but reading literature is a crucially important way for students to gain competence in understanding and acting within others' cultures. So now let's turn back to Dai-yu as she arrives among the Jia. As you probably know, this episode takes up most of the third chapter in Dream of the Red Chamber. In my course on this novel, students would already have read the first two chapters, partly just to know the backstory to Dai-yu's arrival among the Jia. And in our second meeting on Zoom, I am going to describe in a bit more detail how I teach the entire novel, and within it other episodes, including the first two chapters. But for your courses, you may only have time to present a shorter portion, such as Dai-yu's arrival. So for this video, I will illustrate how I would present only this story without giving students any other part of Dream of the Red Chamber. I might use other materials, but I would not necessarily have them read the entire novel if all I had was one class to teach this story. So what I would do for that class is I would give them about 15 pages of chapter 3 for them to read, and I would give it to them from the main English translation of Dream of the Red Chamber, which is by David Hawkes, and uses the title Story of the Stone, or Shitoji. I have supplied that text in the comments, or in the information section of this YouTube video. You'll find a titled link to Dai-yu's arrival, so you can see what I would give the students in the way of an English text. And you might want to read that text before our Zoom session following your viewing of this video, because I will make some references to that text. And if you have a different kind of class, or you don't even have time for them to read 15 pages of the English, you could use clips from the television series, both in 1987 and in 2010, the series that were made then. And if you have time, you could use both of those videos to compare the interpretations of this passage, so that students could get an idea of the freedom that they would have to interpret, and how two productions of Chinese television have interpreted the novel, because we don't want them to think that the novel is only open to one interpretation, though comparing the two interpretations and Chinese reactions to them would be another interesting thing to do in terms of presenting the novel as a form of Chinese culture that has now taken place in Chinese television as well as literature. So the way I think might be most helpful to introduce the novel through its history is through the figure of Cao Shuiqin. And you can do this with any of the novels, but particularly with the case of Cao Shuiqin. You can also give students a sense of how the novel is in certain aspects autobiographical, at least in very large outline, by relating to them that Cao Shuiqin was born in 1715 or 24, it's not clear, but that his grandfather, Cao Yin, was a very close associate of the Kangxi Emperor of the Qing dynasty, but that the Cao family fell out of imperial favor soon after Cao Shuiqin was born, and that their name was disgraced and their immense wealth confiscated. Cao becomes a more sympathetic figure when we know that he lived in relative poverty for the rest of his life after that confiscation, and that he was virtually unknown outside of a small circle of family and literary friends, and spent the last 10 years of his life or so writing one of China's greatest novels before he died in the woods above Beijing in 1763. All of that will help you introduce some of the context of the writing of the novel and where some of the story of the novel comes from in Cao Cuiqin's own life. But if you have any other time to present, you might also present the fact that Cao Cuiqin was the author as well of a tradition of kite design, which is known as the Cao tradition, an example of which is pictured here, the double-hearted sparrow. So even if you don't present this much on Cao Cuiqin, I would certainly introduce students to the background of the character of Dai-yu as we meet her in Chapter 3, which means presenting on the frame story of the novel of Dream of the Red Chamber, which I'm calling here the story of the stone and flower. You could present a few pages of the first chapter if you wanted to, or you could just describe how the stone and flower became the hero and heroine of the novel in general. And I would do this in the form of a short fable or sort of a fairy tale, which it is essentially, telling students at least as much that the stone was first made by the goddess Nuwa to repair a hole in the heavens, but was thrown away as unfit, and that despairing, it decided to go down to the realm of red dust in the form of a human boy, Jia Baoyu, and on the way that the stone conceived a love, a kind of love for the crimson pearl flower, whom it watered with dew and brought to consciousness. The image here we have of that relationship between the stone and flower. The flower, of course, then going on with the stone into the human realm in the form of a girl who, importantly, has conceived a debt of tears to pay the stone back for his kindness in watering her to consciousness. So this may be somewhat puzzling to your students, but it should also be intriguing, and it will give them a taste, for example, of Chinese mythology, and enlist their imaginations in their opportunities to interpret the story. You can also introduce larger themes that will be very interesting, I think, to teenage minds, such as love and fate and self-worth, and even the story of the goddess Nuwa, and the coming of the flood through the torn heavens would be interesting for them to compare, for example, to the story of the flood in the Hebrew Bible. Finally, we can arrive with Dai-yu at the swirling household of the Jia, with its many servants, its relatively complicated array of cousins and aunts, and the imposing but ultimately sympathetic figure of the matriarch Jia Mu, or Grandmother Jia. We witness here, as in this image again from Sun Wen, in the story, we witness Dai-yu being led from room to room and mansion to mansion to greet all her new relatives. We watch her dine with her hosts, and we are also given a view of things through her own eyes when she watches the arrival of Wang Xifeng, the very colorful Wang Xifeng, and the idea of a daughter-in-law who pays a little less deference to her mother-in-law when she comes into the room at first, might be something that the students pick up on, or a way of illustrating family themes that will be of great interest in the context of studying Confucian habits and rituals. Also, the meal that Dai-yu takes with her new family later in the chapter, and the very careful way she observes how one takes tea in the north as opposed to how she takes tea in the south. The fact that she's fortunate in observing how one takes tea so she doesn't swallow the mouthwash. So, in other words, having studied a short reading from the novel and maybe watched a clip or two from the television adaptations, and whatever other background materials you've chosen, you should be ready to pursue a variety of opening questions that you have devised to draw students into the story, whatever form the story has taken for them. Just to note, before you begin your discussion and having crafted your questions, open with them, you want to make sure that the students are going to be mostly talking to each other, so you may want to think about the arrangement of your classroom. If your classroom is traditional, where all of the tables or desks face front, you might want to think about positioning your students so that they're speaking with you, and you take something of a role on the sidelines. Now, for the purposes of illustrating some key questions on Dai-yu's arrival, I've chosen to highlight the concept of family, which is the first of the 5 major themes that structure the advanced placement exam. I note that the authors of the advanced placement course and exam in Chinese culture and language offer the following 3 essential questions to consider in relation to the theme of family. So the AP, when they want your students to think about family, offer the 3 following questions. What constitutes a family in Chinese-speaking societies? What are some important aspects of family values and family life in Chinese-speaking societies? And finally, what challenges do families face in today's world? So, given those 3 questions from the AP, generally about family, I offer students, or I offer you, the 3 following questions to consider as opening questions. The first being, is the Jia family Dai-yu's family? Again, here you will have them thinking in kind of evaluative terms, wondering how much a girl like Dai-yu, who has lost her mother and changed whole regions to come to a strange new family that has some odd ways, how much she might think of herself as a member of that family, even though she's told very explicitly during the passage in chapter 3 that she is to consider herself a member of the Jia family. So this would be, I think, a good opening question that related to, again, that AP question, what constitutes a family in general? The second question, what customs and values does Dai-yu observe among the Jia? This is a bit more of a comprehension question, having them do a close reading of the chapter for picking out customs, rituals, values. For example, the value of education. There's a line in the chapter you may see if you read it that the 3 cousins that Dai-yu meets on her arrival are given the day off from their studying. So we know that the Jia family is one that values education for its daughters as well as its sons, which is a significant value that your students might be interested in discussing. And then finally, what challenges would a family like the Jia encounter in today's world? Would be a question that you could use to generalize the story out into today's lives, and that would be, I think, a fair question to use either to end or even to begin if you have a short amount of time and you want students to think about how this story, which is now a few hundred years old, might help the Chinese understand themselves today, because it still is very popular, clearly. And then what I'm going to ask you to do now is consider some opening questions on this same episode, that is the episode of Dai-yu's arrival among the Jia, which again we've assumed that you know at least in outline, but you can refresh yourselves on either by the English translation, which we've linked to here, or consulting your own edition of The Dream of the Red Chamber, Hong Lo Mong. To consider how you might craft opening questions on the theme of identity, which is the second of the AP's five major themes that they want students to consider. I've supplied here the AP's questions on identity, the general AP questions on identity, and I would invite you to craft your own 4 questions, maybe as versions of these on Dai-yu's arrival. And once you've crafted those, keep them close by. We'll talk about the questions that you've done in response to this exercise when we meet over the Zoom meeting following your viewing of this video. So finally, I'm going to make quick reference before I go away to the ebook language lessons that Sun Lao has prepared. As you'll see, they consist of 3 major parts. A Chinese sort of retelling of here the episode of Dai-yu's arrival. The whole ebook contains, I believe, 7 other short stories, short versions of episodes from the novel that tell, in general, the arc, as I described it, of the story of the stone and the flower, the tragic love between Jia Baoyu and Lin Dai-yu, along with some mention of characters like Wang Shifeng, Shui Baochai, and Jia Mu. Sun Lao has then given some comprehension questions in Chinese and some vocabulary lessons. So just a few remarks on that resource in case you're interested in asking her about that. So finally, 谢谢. I appreciate your time that you've taken to watch this video, and I look forward to meeting you soon on Zoom so we can talk more about the lesson that I just outlined for you, lessons that you might want to teach, and more generally how I teach this novel to American students and how the American students, in my experience, have reacted to that. So, see you soon, and thanks for watching. Bye-bye.